Hello and welcome to Analysis with me, John Rees. The Egyptian government fell last week, and ever since there's been speculation about why. Was it a result of widespread strike action over the failure to fully implement a long-promised minimum wage? Some said it was to pave the way for General al-Sisi to run for president, but he reappeared in the new government as Minister for Defence. And what are we to make of the new Prime Minister, a former leading light in dictator Hosni Mubarak's front party, the NDP? Well, to discuss the issues, I'm joined by lawyer Tamar Baguette, by Shazia Arzad, Press and Parliamentary Officer for the Middle East Monitor, and David Waring, journalist and PhD candidate at the School of Oriental and African Studies. On Skype, we're joined by former Egyptian MP, Dr. Abdul Magoud Dadari. But first, let's take a look at this report.
In a televised speech last Monday, Egypt's interim Prime Minister Hazem Bablawi announced the en masse resignation of his cabinet, amid criticism of the government's failure to resolve Egypt's socio-political and fiscal challenges. His successor, Ibrahim Mahlab, Egypt's former housing minister, has vowed at this very critical juncture to eliminate terrorism and crack down on violence.
The battle Egypt is facing against the powers of evil and terrorism is not only in defense of the Egyptian interest and its security. It's also a battle we are fighting on behalf of the entire region. We will be victorious in this battle, God willing.
In stark contrast to Mahlab's urgent address, thousands have been killed and thousands more languish in jails following the brutal clampdown on the Muslim Brotherhood last year. In the last week, 504 pro-Morsi supporters were referred to court facing murder, terrorist and illegal assembly charges. In a recent press release, the Brotherhood stated, "Resignation of those who oversaw the impoverishment and the killing of Egyptians and sold the homeland to foreign powers will not be absolved of responsibility." Al-Sisi is trying to get rid of the black box of his crimes, forgetting that since the coup, he is the de facto ruler of the ruins that used to be Egypt, and his hands are certainly stained with the blood of them. The announcement of Mahlab's appointment has caused a stir amongst opponents of the government that accuse newly appointed Prime Minister of having ties to Hosni Mubarak's former National Democratic Party. Yet Mahlab, civil engineer by trade and former CEO of Arab Contractors, has made his vision explicitly clear to the Egyptian masses, laying particular emphasis on the construction and development of the nation. Yet with only less than 2 weeks remaining until Egypt's parliamentary elections, analysts say that this abrupt manoeuvre could create an open path for Defence Minister Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to run for the presidential title. Notwithstanding the ambiguity surrounding the debacle, supporters of the military-backed government have persistently denied allegations regarding Sisi's bid for the presidency.
There is no relation between the resignation of the government and the presidential elections in general. We want a government that can face crises and provide security. The government has failed in all of these.
While Sisi has retained his position as defence minister in the caretaker government, the cult of personality that has emerged around his character subsequent to Morsi's oustation indicates that Sisi remains the nation's forerunner in the race for the presidential title. But how will the caretaker government deal with mounting criticism against it? And what are the risks of excluding the Muslim Brotherhood from the upcoming presidential and parliamentary elections? Although Egyptian law stipulates the entire cabinet must step down following when the Prime Minister resigns, many ministers appear to have retained their positions. It might be too early for predictions on whether the cabinet resignation might intensify political protest against another era of military rule or ameliorate the enveloping crisis. Nazli Tazi, Islam Channel.
OK, so David, why did this happen? I mean, it wasn't sort of trailed, there was no big build-up. Suddenly the government wasn't there any longer. What's your reckoning?
As an outside observer, it's really hard to discern. I think it seems as though we can only speculate about what's happening. There's been very little explanation. It doesn't say much for the democratic credentials, as if we thought it had any, this new regime. The fact that very little explanation of what's happening and why it's happened. I guess, as you said in your intro, there was some speculation at the beginning that the reason was to clear the way for Sisi to make his presidential bid. Well, Sisi immediately pops up in the new cabinet. And in any case, does Sisi need everyone for him to resign for him to then stand as president? Probably not. So the next thing you can speculate about is the economic situation in the country, the fuel shortages, power cuts, failure to implement fully the minimum wage, as you said, and really enormous strike action that's been going on over recent weeks. My sense is that this was a kind of a cosmetic change. This is kind of, we'll let the cabinet take the fall. The cabinet's role, it seems to me, the civilian government's role, is a kind of a human shield for the military. Let them take the fall, let them do day-to-day management. If day-to-day management isn't working out, as it isn't at the moment, let them take the fall for it and protect Sisi that way. Sisi doesn't want to be announcing his presidential bid with this chaos going on and with this discredited cabinet.
I mean, you've been following some of the strike action, it sounds like to me. So, I mean, it was a minimum wage that was implemented for some people, but left very wide swathes of people out of the legislation. Is that right?
Yeah, and it sounds as though some people who were initially promised to be included in it were then not included. So yeah, there's widespread disquiet about that, understandably.
Shazia, what do you make of it? What's your answer to the puzzle of why this government went?
I think, I mean, it's quite difficult, obviously, to work out a lot of what's going on behind the scenes, because there's been very much this kind of, very well-varnished cabinet that they've tried to put together. It's not obviously the case, that given the fact that they've resigned so quickly. But the fact is that the country is politically unstable, economically unstable, and those factors would certainly have had an impact. We know that the new regime came in, they said that they were going to fix the economy, and they haven't done that. There are still protests going on almost every day across Egypt, and they're not just confined to Cairo, and that kind of speaks to the widespread dissatisfaction. So those factors, coupled in with, all the general kind of other factors that are going on at the moment, kind of lend one to believe that, the cabinet are going to have to kind of pay the price for their failings, really.
Tamo, go on. Let's have your bet on this one.
Sure. I think anything really any analysis being said is speculative, as you've already highlighted. However, I think one needs to kind of take a step back and realize that a big part of the attack on the cabinet as a whole has been continuous. The Biblawi cabinet as a whole has
the previous
administration has been continuously attacked on the basis that they haven't been transparent. They haven't really had a strong or a good relationship with the media. They haven't been able to communicate any of the changes in any of the bills or any of the legislative changes they've done. They came out with 2 different stimulus packages earlier in the year, actually late last year, one of which was by most economists and financial analysts was thought to be great. A lot of the money was also pumped in, obviously, through the Gulf. The second stimulus package, most people who followed the economy knew was going to be a mistake, and that was basically the increase of minimum wage from approximately 700 Egyptian pounds to 1,200 Egyptian pounds, which was meant to be rolled out January of this year. Obviously, one of the big issues they had was when they came to roll it out, realized that this could not be a continuous part of the budget just because the funds are not available. And as a result, obviously, what happened was certain public civil servants were excluded of it, and there was a big part of the population whom had expected to receive it and didn't, and then hence the strikes kind of kicked off. So I think when you look at it, a combination of we're supposed to be going into presidential elections followed by parliamentary elections, you have this sudden boost of strikes taking place all over the place because finally people were beginning to believe that the minimum wage was finally kicking in. In addition to the continuous lack of any form of communication, I think probably from the military and or the interim government, their feeling was, going into presidential elections, the last thing anyone needs is more public strikes, more unrest, and then in addition, further making the economic crisis even deeper. Now, with respect to Sisi, I'm not surprised to see him back as the Minister of Finance because the election laws have not, as the Minister of Defense, because the laws for the actual presidential elections haven't been rolled out yet. We're expecting them to come out on Thursday. So I think for a lot of the candidates who are kind of, gun jumping and saying and nominating themselves, I think he's playing, the game kind of more in a, keeping his cards close. I think the bigger question is whether he will really nominate himself next week, hopefully, or the week after, once the laws are actually in place, then you can actually nominate yourself. I don't think really, any politician would go out trying to nominate and run for president, irrespective of the pressure, given the fact that you don't even know what rules or laws you're being playing by.
Dr. Dari, what do you reckon is behind this then? Hello, can you hear me, Dr. Dari?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you for having me.
No, you're welcome.
We're talking about as if we're talking about a normal government of the people, for the people, by the people. This government is considered by majority of Egyptians as a coup government that came by the military coup, and so it does not really represent the people of Egypt, and it is not of the people or by the people, or for sure not from the people of Egypt. So it is not a representative government. It failed because it had to fail because of the military. The military did not only kidnap the president, cancel the constitution, and cancel the elected body, but also killed thousands of Egyptians and imprisoned more than 23,000 of Egyptians, political prisoners now in Egypt. So what do you expect of a government that's trying to rule over the people whom it does not represent? The political polarization in the country is one of the main reasons, in addition to the other reasons mentioned by the other respected guests you have in the studio. The economic problems are still there. The military promised to solve so many problems and to bring the country together. It failed on almost all fronts, on the social fronts, economic fronts, political fronts. So my analysis is the failure of the government has a lot to do. It is the same actor that made President Morsi fail in his economic policy in the country, is this acting again behind Biblawi and making him fail again. It is the military.
Okay. Just let me ask you a question about the protests then, because although there have been continuing protests about the removal of President Morsi, they haven't had enough traction to really damage the government. Do you think the eruption of the strikes is bringing another force onto the field against the government, which is perhaps for the first time since President Morsi was removed, going to tilt the balance again?
That is very important element getting into the strikes and the marches in the streets. These strikes have been going on for some time, but they waited for a couple of months to see what the Sisi government is going to do. When it didn't deliver what it promised, people had to go to the streets. And there is another fact. Let us not talk about Egyptians as economic beings. They're very much political beings, because there is no freedom. There is no freedom of movement, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. So all these factors gather together to lead to the failure of the government. And there is not going to be a success. There is no, you cannot have parliamentary election under a military coup. You cannot have presidential election fair and free. Even some liberals now are coming to their conscience. And when I say liberals, I mean Egyptian liberals are coming back to their consciousness and saying there can be election. There can be free and fair election. When people protest,
we'll come back. We'll come back to that point in a moment. First, David, what are we to make of the new Prime Minister? Here's someone who's was leading figure in the old Mubarak NDP party. What kind of signal do you think that sends?
Yeah, leading figure in the NDP and also a business tycoon. I mean, it looks like a shuffling of the deck chairs. It looks like the cosmetic change that it probably is. I think it's kind of indicative of that. We're just seeing a recycling of remnants of the old regime. So
it's probably the most senior appointment of somebody from the old regime, though, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying it's not insignificant, but I think it fits into a general pattern post-coup of, seeing the old guard reasserting itself.
Yeah, I mean, this fits into a wider pattern of kind of Mubarak-era figures returning, doesn't it, Shazia?
Yeah, exactly. And I think one of the things that we knew pretty much from the time of the coup onwards was that actually this was just a case of people from the old regime and the military working together to basically get rid of the Brotherhood and kind of reassert themselves and regain some power. We know that the military and the old regime had a very, very close ties, and they had worked together very closely. And as the military and some of the leading figures from that old regime kind of worked together to come about in the coup, it's kind of inevitable, actually, that some of those figures are going to take leading positions in the new regime.
Tamara, what do you make of the cabinet as a whole? Is it, as David suggests, a shuffling of the same characters or the same forces at any rate?
I would think that's a little bit of an overstretch of a statement, because when you look at the cabinet itself, you had 36 prime minister, now you have 31. There was a bunch of folding and consolidation, about 4 or 5 different ministries. I do agree that Prime Minister Mahlib, the current prime minister that replaced Biblawi, is probably one of the most senior former NDP party members. But we had 18 prime ministers that were unchanged, 13 of which were changed. When you look at the 13 that were replaced, you'll find that 12 of them actually don't really have much of a political affiliation and are in essence looked at as technocrats. When you look at those who have maintained kind of being in the ministry, you'll find 6 of them actually are remnants of the Morsi era. Now, when you say whether it's a reshuffling of the cards, Egypt had for almost 30 years one party. It's very difficult to now, given the institutions, given the deep states, to think that we're going to eventually suddenly show up with a parliament that has 0 members that were, even broadly or indirectly affiliated to the NDP. I think that's just, it will take time to kind of wash it out and create your new parties and move forward. I think what's interesting to see is the fact that Mahlib is the new prime minister. Whether he remains after, the presidential elections, I think that's where the interest will lie, and whether, indeed, going back to your initial question of, is this basically a cabinet that's paving the way for Sisi to come forward, or are they basically just backstopping any potential crisis that then could lead into further instability and throw off the, transitional progress that everyone's been marching towards? And I think that's really the more interesting question. I wouldn't necessarily label the reshuffling of the cabinet of, new NDP members now showing up, because I think that's a little bit unfair once you dig deeper and look at all the, 31 different ministers that have showed up as a new cabinet about a week ago.
Dr. Didari, how do you read the cabinet as a whole? Do you read it as a sort of an entrenching of some of the old NDP people, or is it different to that, as Tamer was suggesting?
It seems that the Sisi government is trying to bring a Mubarak regime without Mubarak himself, and this will not be accepted by the Egyptian people. The Egyptian people will continue resisting this in the streets, and that change is very cosmetic. It will not solve the problems in Egypt. Most likely this government will fail even in shorter period of time than the previous one. There is no stability in Egypt unless there is a political exit for the crisis created by the military. Let us not ignore the millions of people marching on a daily basis throughout the whole country, saying no to the military coup. And let us not forget that the previous government, which large number of it is still in the government, are considered to be criminals because they killed thousands of Egyptians in the streets of Egypt and imprisoning thousands of Egyptians more. So let us not forget the political element and the human element in this change.
OK, well, I think that's probably about all we've got time for the first half of the programme, but we'll be looking at a little bit more depth about what this change of government in Egypt might mean for the Egyptian people and where it fits into the broader history of the Egyptian revolution and the counter-revolution that overthrew President Morsi last year. So do rejoin us after the break.